Right. Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all keeping well. And tonight we're going to look at something quite fascinating in the general context of the last several Torah portions, tying in uniquely and specifically with this week's Torah portion. And it is this: what is the general Jewish approach to money and materialism? Is it wrong to want to make money? Is it a mistaken pursuit to go after material things? Well, with that in mind, let us consider the following. One of the cardinal principles of Judaism is that everything is basher. Nothing happens just by chance. We're not some consequence or random quirks or mere victims of circumstance. We believe and we know that everything as it transpires in the material is rooted in the spiritual. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi once said, we have to live with the times. And with that, he meant that we can look at Torah portions of each week and not just reflect on them as some sort of story of the past, but rather with categorical life lessons that we can apply into our own daily living. So let's reflect on some of the Torah portions, in fact, particularly the last two in this week's, the genesis of our world, and to see some interesting lessons. At the very beginning, in Bereshit, we're told about the story of creation of the very first man, Adam. No sooner had he been charged with his task, and he comes face to face with his own frailty and mortality. No sooner is he given paradise at his fingertips, and he finds himself abusing it, as it were. For whatever the justifications that he chose to eat from the tree, the bottom line remains the same. He was given a blessing. He was given a gift, and he abused that sacred trust. He lost sight of the purpose of that gift to the point where he became self-indulgent. It's mine, it's here, I want to do with it as I please. And no sooner is he placed in a vast universe to engage with it and safeguard it, l'avda u'lishamra, the words of the Torah, and he comes to discover almost immediately the temporal state of our physical world. And by definition, everything in life around us is mortal, everything is temporary, everything is impermanent, everything erodes, everything ages. And frankly, we need that sense of mortality without which we wouldn't experience life the way that it needs to be experienced. We wouldn't be able to properly experience joy. We wouldn't be driven to accomplish. We wouldn't care to love, and we wouldn't cherish everything we have. Or plain and simply put, if we were to live forever, then we wouldn't be driven or motivated towards anything. And yet, in the midst of it all, we seem to sometimes act without a care, without a sense of balance, without an appreciation for what is true and of lasting value. In fact, we sometimes might behave with that same sense of arrogance that Adam did when eating from the tree. We act as though we are immortal, as though we are going to live forever. And what does the Torah tell us immediately in response to this? And the eyes of Adam and Eve were opened. They're riding high. They're living it up in paradise, so to speak, or quite literally. And they lost perspective, and they decided they should do as they want. Stretch the boundaries a little, acquire more than they were entitled, cross the lines in order to have more as they ate from the tree. And the next thing they find themselves doing is struggling. God sends them out from the Garden of Eden. They lose their paradise and they have to start working the ground. They didn't appreciate how good they had it. They weren't sufficiently cognizant of the blessings in their lives. And as a result, they end up confronting struggle and hardship. And I think it's fair to say that in our 21st century world today, we're pretty much in that same state. We've had it so good for so long, we've lost sight of what really matters. One would have thought maybe that COVID would have realigned our thinking, enabling us to put things in better perspective. The world, after all, was shut down for more than a year, and we had time to pause to think. And you know what? I've come to realize as a result of the last 18 or so months, we come knocking on heaven's door when we feel desperate, when our bottom line gets hit, when the eye comes under threat. Human nature is conditioned with the survival instinct, which dictates that we think only about ourselves. In the good times, as we look to accumulate more and more, and in the harder times when we might be hurting. And while God won't ask you why you didn't call on him when things were tough, he'll want to know whether you were also there to thank him when the going was good. Fundamental to human nature is that when we are under threat, that's when we look to rediscover what we left behind. What do we leave behind? A basic concept in Kabbalah is that everything as it transpires in the physical is really a reflection of the spiritual. And sometimes we become so overindulgent in the physical in our material pursuits. Sometimes we think, as in the words of Deuteronomy, it was my own strength and personal power that brought me all this prosperity. And therefore, we tend to think that the extra hours we'll put in will make all the difference, to the point where we compromise on the essentials, on family, on religion, on so many things spiritual. And we delude ourselves into thinking that's what's going to bring about our blessings. The Talmud tells us that God determines already at the outset of every year, on Rosh Hashanah, how much we're going to earn during the course of the year. And by definition, therefore, yes, of course, we have to make ourselves a conduit through which to receive the blessings. But even in so doing, we must never become indulgent to the point where the material pursuit overtakes spiritual responsibility. In other words, sometimes people wonder, why am I not making it? And the answer is, it's precisely our determination and our obsession with material growth that generates a spiritual vacuum, which in turn then feeds back into the material as well. And if only we would be more focused on the spiritual, however, we might choose to express that personally in our own day-to-day living, giving more charity, especially when maybe the temptation is there to cut back. That's when the material will take care of itself. And so sometimes we have to look inside and ask ourselves, what has become my objective in life? The Talmud famously says, he who has 100 wants 200, and he who has 200 wants 400. That's human nature. And today's generation, frankly, it doesn't cry over spilled milk anymore. It cries over spilled champagne. Today, people don't complain about the lack of necessities, but they complain about the abundance of benefits. They moan over the frills, not the basics. In fact, the greatest irony of today's generation is that the source of their problems is often the very blessings themselves. Now, Adam and Eve had two sons. The first was called Cain. Cain actually came from the root word kinyan, which means acquisition, which suggests the material dimension, acquisition. The second son was called Abel, meaning fleeting breath, referring to the fragility of life. And it's precisely that tiny breath which separates the living from the non-living. Lose that breath and you've lost everything. And our problem is we look to compensate for the fragility of life by accumulating possessions. And the end result is that sometimes Cain can then kill Abel. The verse tells us very categorically, not on bread alone does man live, but rather all that which emerges from the mouth of God is how man shall live. It's not just about the bread, about the material. You can't live like that, but rather all that which comes out of the mouth of God. Well, what comes out of the mouth of God? We know the 10 expressions with which he brought the world into being and which underlays the world constantly all through the ages. We know the 10 commandments with which, together with everything else, God defined our role and purpose. In other words, our goal is to combine the physical and the spiritual in balance. Every single day in our prayer service, and certainly all the more so during the high points of our holiday seasons, we recite the Priestly Benediction, which, as we know, consists of 3 parts. The first is, Yevarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, may God bless you and protect you. That, we're told, refers to material blessings. Yair Hashem panav elecha b'chunecha, God should cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. That, we're told, refers to the spiritual. Yisu Hashem panav elecha v'yasnecha shalom, God should raise his countenance to you and give you peace. This is the notion of finding the right balance, whereby we achieve real stability and peace. When we find the right balance between the material and the spiritual, then we have peace of mind and tranquility of spirit in our lives. I'm going to come back to the story of Noah in a little bit, but I want to jump into this week's portion, because frankly, it would seem that it's precisely in this week's portion that we encounter what is essentially the very first ever recession that we know of in all of mankind, all of human history. The Torah actually tells us there was a famine in the land. And then the Torah reiterates and says the hunger was especially severe. No food, no economy, market meltdown, to use modern jargon. And several verses later, we read how Abraham has amassed immense wealth. And so did Lot, his nephew. Abraham, as we know, retains his wealth. Lot loses it all. We have to assume so because he barely escaped Sodom with the shirt on his back. Now let's contrast their attitudes. Early on, twice in the same verse, we are told that Lot and Abraham could not coexist. Why not? We're told this twice to suggest that there were some real practical economic problems, but there were also some real ideological differences. On the practical side, there wasn't enough land to accommodate all their cattle. On the ideological side, we know that their individual shepherds argued. Abraham's shepherds insisted that their animals are properly muzzled, and Lot's shepherds are seen grazing in other people's fields. The theft carried out by Lot's shepherds is just another consequence of greed, of wanting more. And you have to wonder, why does the Torah tell us that Abraham accumulated a lot of cattle, which was given to him by the king of Egypt? And then we're told Lot was also accumulated a lot of cattle and also tents. Why am I beginning an inventory of Lot's possessions? Why does the Torah feel the need to add in this extra detail and also tents? What's the message? And I suggest to you, the families are traveling. Abraham's family, Lot's family, from one point to the next. And at this point, they're not settled anywhere. Yes, cattle, you can and need to schlep from point A to point B. Even as you travel, you lead your herd with you, food, for trade, etc. What does Lot need with a bunch of tents? When you settle, wherever that may be, you acquire tents to settle it. Why does he have it now with him whilst in transit? And again, I think it's a further example of demonstrating to us how his mindset is just one of getting what you can, while you can, however you can. You know, they tell a story of a very spoiled girl, really spoiled, who always got whatever she wanted. And she truly believed the world was hers for the picking. And so she goes to her rabbi one day. She says, Rabbi, oh yeah, I'm so spoiled once again. Spoiled for choice. Both Chaim and Moshe love me. Tell me, Rabbi, which one do you think will marry me? Which one will be the lucky one? To which the rabbi replies, Chaim will marry you. Moshe will be the lucky one. Lucky indeed is the one who keeps life in balance and doesn't always feel the need to restlessly pursue every conquest. And that's why immediately after, we're told how Lot chooses to go down to Sodom. Sodom and Gomorrah, the land's known for their greed and gluttony. And the end result is that he loses all of his wealth. Abraham, on the other hand, retains his. Now let's consider Sodom and Gomorrah. I find it fascinating to observe how these two ancient cities, with only one small dedicated section in the Torah, and very little reference anywhere else, have always nevertheless been retained in the vernacular. There are numerous cities mentioned throughout the Torah. You try typing them into your computer, you'll get red lines all over them. They're not identifiable. They don't have any correct spelling. Try looking them up in any modern day encyclopedia, you won't find them. Google them, they don't exist. But Sodom and Gomorrah, cities that existed more than 4,000 years ago, you'll find reference to them everywhere. See, what we know about these cities, their identifying features that they were corrupt. There are various opinions as to the sort of decadence they characterized, but here again, you have to be intrigued. I'm fascinated. For one thing, if you make a rough calculation, you'll know that the episode of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed was just over 390 years after the flood. And if you take into account the time it would take to build these cities after the flood, you have just over 2 centuries in which they spiraled into a morally devoid abyss. What went wrong in such a short period of time? Moreover, the one classic sin brought by the commentaries is that they disallowed or they mistreated guests that came into their cities. Is that so bad that it necessitates destruction? What is so ingrained in the personification of Sodom and Gomorrah that it has retained its vitality through the ages? We talk about them as examples of decadence up until present day. And I suggest to you that the threat they posed wasn't so much the sin per se, whatever that might have been. In itself, you're right, it doesn't necessarily warrant destruction. It's the underlying theme of the sins, the very engine that generates greater iniquity and runs the risk of spilling out beyond their immediate vicinities, penetrating all boundaries and borders. A threat so sinister that it appears innocuous, but like a germ, it breeds on itself and ultimately wreaks havoc throughout. And it is a threat that is every bit as prevalent today as it was back then. It's called excess. You know, people go for the extreme. Excess. You want to drive a faster car. You want to climb a higher mountain. You want to push yourself to the max. People no longer look to contain or restrict themselves. Everything has to be newer, flashier, wilder, more amazing, more shocking, more delicious, more disgusting, more disturbing, more expensive, more groundbreaking, bigger, louder, or cruder. We live in a world that pushes its boundaries, that doesn't like to maintain a status quo, that needs, you might say, new degrees of cruder sensationalism just to keep people remotely interested. And against that, what do you have today? You have road rage, you have plane rage. Go to a supermarket, you have checkout rage. Look at youth today, you have youth rage, age rage, new names for extreme new syndromes that encapsulate the corrosive impatience and instant anger, which is just another feature of our want it now, want it faster, want it better world. In fact, consider carefully the choice wording of the verse that first introduces us to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. What it says is that the inhabitants of Sodom were evil and sinners. Why the double wording? Tell me they're evil, or tell me they're sinners. If they're evil, I know they're sinners. If they're sinners, I know they're evil. Why the double wording? So the commentaries, Rashi in particular, puts it in perspective. He says they were evil with their bodies, and they were sinners with their money. With their bodies, they were unfaithful to one another. But what enables this depravity? What defines them as sinners? The money, the excess, the overindulgence. Because as with every excess, when you shift away from the middle of the road balance, then it invariably leads one closer to the gutter. And indeed, the end result of that is destruction. And then it was in a very real sense. And in our context, we have to also understand that we have to have balance. The individual sin, banning guests from the city. You only do that because of greed, because you don't want them preying on your resources, because you want more for yourself. That's the life that Lot subscribed to. And whilst he was saved, he lost it all. What about Abraham? Note the interesting string of events in our Torah portion. Abraham secures victory in battle on behalf of several kings. It was a famous battle of 4 kings against 5 kings. One of those kings was the king of Sodom, who's now heading out to Abraham to ask for his rescued captives back. And the verse says the king of Sodom went out to meet Abraham to thank him. And then he says to him, give me back the captives that you have rescued from the enemy, and I will give you possessions. Right away, that's the thinking. It's about money, the excess. That's what they know of Sodom. And Abraham says, from a thread to a shoelace, I won't touch anything of yours. He has more than enough. He doesn't need more. The way of Sodom is not the way of Abraham. But you know what? The verses don't flow in sequence. When you look carefully at the portion, after telling us how the king headed out to meet Abraham, the Torah interrupts with an altogether different exchange between Abraham and another king. His name was Melchizedek, who was a Kohen, a priest of God. And we are told that this was actually Shem, the son of Noah, the righteous son of Noah. And the Torah tells us suddenly, Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything he had. Tzedakah, charity, the precise opposite of excess. Life is like a flame of fire, useful and meaningful in 1,000 ways and more, and dangerous only in one, through excess. By all means, use, but do not abuse. Lot takes, Abraham gives. And there's another dimension, by the way, as to why Abraham doesn't take the money of Sodom. Because the question can be asked, and this is an interesting, a little bit of Talmudic analysis here. Abraham emerges from Pharaoh's clutches in an earlier story, a very wealthy man, weighed down with money, in the words of the Torah. He happily accepts when Pharaoh sends him on his way all the gifts that Pharaoh gives him. He'd be a fool to have turned it down. But when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, there he refuses, like we said, even a thread or a shoelace. Don't think that the reason for his refusal is because the money is not for him to take. You know, when kings capture property, halakhically, what you capture in war is rightfully yours. So now that Abraham captured the money as he won and was victorious in battle, everything he captured should be halakhically his. Why then does he give it all back to the king of Sodom and object to having any of it? Moreover, if God says, I will bless you with wealth, and Abraham sees that fulfilled in Pharaoh's generosity, why doesn't he also see it being fulfilled by the gifts of the king of Sodom as well? And the answer is this. Listen to this. It's quite beautiful and it is very profound. There's a verse in Proverbs which says, it is the blessings of God that makes one wealthy, and there is never any upset with it. There's no upset that comes with it. If your acquired wealth causes upset or bad feeling, if you aggressively pursue it, No matter how many heads were stepped on or how got crushed in the process, that's not part of the divine blessing. So when it came to Egypt, the king offers Abraham some of his wealth, and everyone else there has theirs, and everyone's happy. No problem. But this was money that was initially pillaged from the people of Sodom during the battle. Right now, they haven't got 2 pennies to rub together. The king of Sodom says to Abraham, you keep the money, just give me back the captives. Abraham, right though he may have been to keep the money, halachically it was correct for him, but beyond the letter of the law, people will be hurt, and that's not part of divine blessing. And in keeping with this theme, let's consider something else as well. Why does Abraham actually bother to engage in this battle? Why does he go out and join to wage battle against these 5 kings? And the answer is because his nephew, Lot, is in danger. He was, like we established, a resident of Sodom. And when the citizens of Sodom were taken captive, so was Lot. So Abraham is going to wage this battle, effectively putting himself on the line to go ahead and save Lot. Why? What's he thinking? Does Abraham have to go risk his own life to save his nephew? In the normal scheme of things, short of a miracle, that's tantamount to suicide, trying to wage a battle on your own or with 318 men against 5 kings. You can argue that he's banking on a miracle, but to be sure, God didn't command him. When God tells you to go do something, then you have conviction, you'll be successful. But if God didn't command him, he's doing this of his own initiative, there's no guarantee of a miracle over here. Where God commands you, you maintain the absolute faith and conviction, you'll prevail. You're doing something on your own accord against the odds, the risks you take are your own. Sure, God might pitch in where he deems fit, but in the first instance, you don't have the right to simply rely on the miracle. Thus, bearing in mind the guiding principle of these circumstances that your own life takes precedence, you have to look after number one. When someone else's life is in jeopardy, you have to do what you can to help them, but not when it's at risk to your own life. Then you have to ask, why is Abraham daring to put his own self on the line like that when the Torah says don't? And the answer lies, and again, this is quite beautiful in a little historical context. When Abraham left his father's homeland, his birthplace, the Torah says that when he left, amongst those who went with him was his nephew Lot, who traveled with him. Why does Lot up sticks to travel with Abraham? Nobody asked him to go anywhere. God said to Abraham, you move on to where I'll show you. But the commentaries observe he did so in order to help look after his elderly uncle. It's a very decent and noble gesture. So Lot is leaving his homeland and joins Abraham to Canaan. There's a famine in the land and they have to immediately vacate and go down to Egypt. There they both amass wealth and then they have problems resulting in them parting ways. The uncle goes back to Canaan and the nephew Lot goes to Sodom. Later he's taken captive. So Lot really ends up in this fine mess only because he left his home in the first place in order to care for his elderly uncle Abraham. And as he is now in peril, Abraham knows that the Torah says you don't have to risk your life to save him. But decency, menschlichkeit, says, yes, you do. There are times we can look for the excuse to avoid obligation, and we may well be within our rights. We have to look after number one, but menschlichkeit demands otherwise. In times of crisis, we can think about ourselves. We may be perfectly entitled to do so. Halacha might tell us we're within our rights. But common decency and menschlichkeit, going beyond the letter of the law, requires us to go the extra mile. So here again, we come back to the same point. All too often, people relentlessly pursue, they worship the next conquest, the incessant demands to spend more and more and thereby acquire more and more, and people get hurt in the process. There's something wrong with that cycle. It's not part of the divine blessing. Maybe more often than not, you are within your so-called rights, but menschlichkeit demands doing something different, doing something more. People don't worship money. Well, actually, they don't get up in the morning and bow down to their wallets. But try this experiment. Put somebody in a shul, and 2 people approach him. One is a nice, simple guy, and the other is somebody who's known for his wealth and stature. Which one do you think he'll be more inclined to pay attention to? When the simple guy asks, can you do me a favor? And even after you consent, the rich guy says, can you do me a favor? Which one do we think we'll pay more attention to? Which one would you pay more attention to? That's probably part of the problem. In fact, there's a story, it's told about 2 great 18th century brothers, Rav Zusha of Anapoli and Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk. In their formative years, they used to travel to a certain town. On an initial visit, they inquired of a particularly wealthy man where they could stay there, and the man refused. And so they stayed by somebody else, somebody called Reb Aaron, whom, as it happens, was a very holy and pious Jew. And it was sometime later when these two great brothers were discovered, where the eminence of these two great luminaries and giants in Israel became known, and they happened to be traveling to this same town again, and that aforementioned rich man quickly sent for them to come stay by him. The new horses, the fancy buggies that were arranged by the community, they sent those on to him, but they went on foot back to Reb Aaron's house. And you can well imagine the hurt and the upset of the rich man when greeting the empty carriages. He went around to them, he challenged them. Why? And they explained simply, it's not us you want. You've seen us before. You turned us away. It's the new fancy carriages and the muscular horses that define this new so-called stature, which has captured your attention. So we sent those on to you. As for us, we go where we were always welcome. And I'll let that story speak for itself. I'm going to finish with this. What are our values today? Is it the square footage of our house, or is it the amount of love and kindness generated within our homes? What are our children learning to appreciate? Is it how to be driven to accumulate, or how important it is to share? When we wake in the morning, what is the first thought that passes through our minds? Is it how much money I can make today, or how much spirituality can I generate? What forms an integral part of our daily conversation? Is it a chat with colleagues about the next venture or pending holiday, or also some moments of exchange with God by way of prayer, study, and charity? And with this, I conclude coming to Noah. We all know there was a rainbow at the end of the flood. It's a signal of the fact that God was never going to bring a flood again. Why a rainbow? Any number of other signs were available to God. And the answer is this. It was certainly a sign, but it was much more than a sign. It was also criticism of Noah. 120 years he spent talking, preaching about the flood, about destruction, about the need for repentance. One of the longest sermons in human history. Nobody was moved. No one new member. It's grounds for dismissal. And the answer is why? Because Noah's heart wasn't in it. When your heart's not in it, you're not going to make a whole lot of difference. When you don't believe you can make a difference, you won't. Noah cries, the darkness is so thick that no light can penetrate. It's all a lost cause, a foregone conclusion. And so God brings a rainbow, which is a penetration of light into the darkest clouds. The rainbow says to Noah, as it does to all of us, never give up. Behind the clouds is the sun. And even as things might seem so bleak, the simple light of the sun becomes the magnificent spectrum of the rainbow. When you have faith, when you have dark clouds and light penetrates, you see something magnificent. The rainbow says, don't give up. So how do we override our anxieties? How do we, above the ever shifting cautionary winds that sweep through our lives? How do we, with sometimes all concerned about what's going to come my way today? How much am I going to make tomorrow? How's my bottom line going to be this week? Realize that for all the reasons you have to be filled with anxiety and fear, you need to dig deeper and find all the reasons to be grateful. Know that this too is part of a bigger picture, and that every struggle, even if it might be, is for the sake of a greater ascent. Worry less about what you can get out of life and concern yourself more with what you put in, because you make a living by what you get, but you make a life by what you give. And so bear in mind that at the end of the day, everything we have is a divine gift, and we should always be aware of that. We should always be grateful for that, and we should always indeed merit to be blessed with an abundance of both material and spiritual bliss, where God will then surely grant us all of our heart's desires. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and a beautiful week ahead. And we'll see you all again, please God, next week, Thursday.